Thank you, Teresa, and welcome everyone. First, let me say that it is a joy to be here with all of you. And we are going to explore a subject that, at least in the Theosophical tradition, is of paramount importance. As the description said, the idea is to explore this aspect of our soul that is not necessarily understood or kept in mind usually. Let me start with the quote from Plotinus. He says, "If I may venture to state my convictions more clearly against the opinions of others." So when Plotinus was saying this was a kind of new information that he was giving to humanity. Normally, the idea is that the soul is within a body or in a person, but he says, I have to state my own views on this. We have to keep in mind when reading ancient Greek literature that Plato, and for those who may not know, let me say that Plotinus was perhaps the father of a movement that we call it the Neoplatonists. They were around the beginning of the Christian era, and they followed the teachings of Pythagoras and Plato. And Plotinus was the most important philosopher in that tradition and the first one to have works published. And many times when Plato or the Neoplatonists wrote, they wrote whatever could be given to the public, but there was information that they kept that was regarded as esoteric. Plato has some, or around Plato, there is this idea that the dialogues that he wrote were meant for the public, but then in his school, he would teach other things to their students. Not different or contradictory to the dialogues, but some other aspects that he did not want to discuss in public. And I have the impression that when Plotinus is saying this, he may be perhaps giving this view that was perhaps taught in the ancient mysteries, which at the time were secret or private for the people who joined there. But it's interesting that he says, this is not the regular view. So let me read again the quote. "If I may venture to state my convictions more clearly against the opinions of others, as I must, not even our own soul sinks in its entirety, but there is always some part of it in the intelligible world." So in the Platonic view of the cosmos, we have the world of things that we perceive through our senses, which are a shadow or a dim reflection of the real objects or the real entities that they have their reality in this intelligible world. That is called the noetic realm. Noetic comes from the Greek word nous, which is how Plato and most specifically later the Neoplatonists would call this the higher aspect of the soul. Because as we are going to see, there is an embodied aspect of the soul, but the higher aspect of the soul that is always in this spiritual realm, the noetic realm, it's something that we don't experience normally. So why am I starting with Plotinus? In the Key to Theosophy, Blavatsky says that the Theosophical Society is a reincarnation of the Neoplatonic movement. And because in the TS we use Sanskrit words very frequently, people in general have the sense that theosophy is somehow derived from Eastern traditions. But when we look at the teachings in particular, a large aspect of the teachings that came through theosophical authors actually comes from Pythagoras, Plato, and the Neoplatonists. There is a very specific teachings like this one that have been taught by the Neoplatonists, although normally, at least in the writings that we have today, of course, this was so long ago that there may have been more writings that were lost. But normally in Plato and the Neoplatonists, there are hints about this. And modern theosophical teachings developed many of these subjects in a far more consistent and deeper way than what we can get from whatever survived. So let us look at this idea in a theosophical context. There is what we call the higher ego. I mean, you can pronounce it ego or ego. This term was used before modern psychology really took off with Freud and Jung. So the word ego derives from the Greek ego, and it just means I-ness. A sense of I-ness. We have a personal sense of I-ness. I am Pablo, your I-ness that is associated with your personality. And that's the lower ego, or the psychological ego. But there is a higher sense of I-ness. I am a spiritual entity beyond the personality. Personalities that constantly change incarnation after incarnation. That higher sense of I-ness is what we call the higher ego, or in order to differentiate it from the connotations that the word ego has today, we can pronounce it ego in the Greek way. So the higher ego, let's say. This is what we may call our soul, our reincarnating soul, the aspect in ourselves that persist from incarnation to incarnation. Our ordinary mind, our emotions, our bodies, they last for an X amount of time, and then they are dissolved. And then in the new incarnation, we as a soul create a new mind, a new emotional aspect, and a new physical body. So we are going to focus on the higher ego, the soul in us. Blavatsky said that this is the real individuality, or the divine man. Now, remember, this was written at the end of the 19th century. You will find gender language here because that was the use. Also, the word man is a technical word. It comes from Sanskrit. It means the thinker. But when you see man, of course, it means both genders. So the higher ego is the real individuality, or the divine in us, the divine individuality. It is that ego, that causal body, which overshadows every personality. So our soul has a body that sometimes is called the causal body, because in that body are the causes of what we are, who we are. And in each incarnation, aspects of us as the soul, as we are going to see, are expressed through a personality. Personality meaning our mind, emotions, and body. So this is the divine aspect of ourselves. And then she continues. This is a quote from Blavatsky, one of the founders of the Theosophical Society. Then she continues, this ego is still so immeasurably higher than the physical man that it cannot enter into direct relation with the personality, except through its reflection, the lower mind. We are going to see that, but pay attention to this idea, immeasurably higher. So you are this higher ego. When we talk, this is a problem when we talk about the soul. Many times people think that the soul is some kind of attachment to the physical body. We are the body and we have different attachments, let's say, one of them, the soul. But if anything, we are the reverse. We are a soul to which a physical body is attached for the time being during an incarnation, and then we let go of it, and we continue to be what we are, that is the soul. So we as a soul are immeasurably higher than we as a personality. So think about how you think about yourself. What you know about yourself, your mind, your emotions, your physical abilities and features, normally we identify with this. We think we are this. We feel that we are intelligent or dull, skillful or clumsy. But none of this is really who we are. What we are is immeasurably higher than what you think you are. Our personality may have many flaws, but those flaws, as the flaws of the personality, are the flaws of this particular manifestation of mind, of emotions, of body. But we are not that. We are immeasurably higher than that. This is something to meditate on. We will continue to develop this further. So Blavatsky was mentioning the lower mind. Here there is a quote where she explains this. Manas is the Sanskrit word that means mind, from which the English word man derives from the same root as manas, Manas is, as it were, a globe of pure divine light. This is the causal body, a globe of pure divine light. By the way, Plotinus says, if we had to think of the nous is what Blavatsky is calling here the higher ego. So if we have to think of the nous in terms of form, a sphere of light would be an appropriate, image. So this is similar to what Blavatsky is saying here. A globe of pure divine light, a unit from a higher sphere in which is no differentiation. So it's on the spiritual planes, we are this, or our causal body is this globe of pure divine light. Now, descending to a plane of differentiation, that means the mental, emotional, and physical planes. The higher ego emanates a ray, which is itself, which it can only manifest through the personality already differentiated. This ray is the lower manas, while the globe of pure divine light, a Kumara on its own plane. Kumara is the name for one of the celestial beings that Blavatsky talks about in The Secret Doctrine, for example. So she's saying we are a celestial being, a Kumara on our own plane, and we send a ray to the body to be embodied. She says that this ray is sent into the personality, while we are a Kumara on its own plane, the higher ego or higher manas proper. So you see, the idea is that what we send to the personality is only a ray of ourselves. In that image, you see a representation of that. So we are this globe of divine light, a celestial being. That's what we are always. And from time to time, we send just a ray into a body that is being gestated for us to gather some experience from the lower planes. And that's all that is in the personality, just a ray of ourselves. Let's look at this quote. Taking the ego, the higher ego, for the moment as the real man, because beyond the higher ego, there is an even more transcendental nature of who we are. This is what in Hinduism they call Atman. But let us focus, we are focusing now on our individuality. Atman is a universal aspect of ourselves. The ego is the individual aspect of ourselves, of each of us. So taking the ego for the moment as the real man and looking at him on his own plane, Of course, there is no gender at the level of the ego. But the problem, there are two options here. Either we talk in a gendered way or we say it, looking at it, at the ego. But then when we say it is more difficult to identify it as being ourselves because the it seems to be something out there, right? Unfortunately, language is always a limitation. So you have to make an effort to go beyond the language and try to have a sense of what is being trying to convey through that particular language. So looking at the ego on his own plane, we see him to be indeed a glorious being. The only way in which down here we can form a conception of what he really is to think of him as some splendid angel. As Blavatsky was saying, this Kumara, this celestial being. But the expression of this beautiful being, which is what you really are, on the physical plane, may fall far short of all this. Indeed, it must do so. First, because it is only a tiny fragment. And secondly, because it is so hopelessly cramped by its conditions, by the conditions of the lower planes. So this is a quote from Leadbeater. I'm going to show quotes from several theosophical authors here. So he continues, suppose a person put his finger into a hole in the wall or into a small iron pipe so that he could not even bend it. How much of himself as a whole could he express through that finger in that condition? Much like this is the fate of that fragment of the ego, the ray, what Blavatsky called the ray, which is put down into this dense body. It is so small a fragment that it cannot represent the whole. It is so cramped and shut in that it cannot even express what it is. The image is clumsy, but it may give some sort of idea of the relation of the personality to the ego. So you see, it is an interesting idea, although not very, very poetical, but how much of who you are can be expressed in that condition through your finger that is cramped, in a hole or a pipe. He says in some of his other writings, he says the problem. Even if you as the soul could incarnate in 1,000 bodies at the same time, you would not be able to express all you are, because there is a fundamental problem of dimensions. It is like you have figures that are two-dimensional, a square, let's say. Squares have width, length, they don't have height. And no matter how many squares you arrange on a paper, you cannot represent what is a cube, a real cube. Of course, we can draw a perspective of a cube, but they are basically squares. They are not the real cube. You cannot represent, by playing around with 2D figures, a solid or a body that is in 3 dimensions. There is just no way. So who we are is dimensionally higher, who we really are, than the limited expression that comes through us. Leadbeater says all we can aspire for the personality is that nothing that is in the personality is out of tune with us as a soul. But we won't be able to bring who we are into the personality, but we can make sure that whatever is in the personality is attuned with our true nature as a soul. So it is important to keep this in mind, because as Leadbeater says, and this is a universal teaching within the Theosophical tradition, the task before most of us at present is that of realizing the ego as the true man, so that we may let the ego work instead of this false personal self with which we are so ready to identify ourselves. You know, when in Light on the Path, a small book that is a theosophical classic, it says, let the warrior fight in thee. You know, not just, of course, this metaphor of fighting and war, etc., is typical in spiritual literature, and it doesn't mean an actual external fight, but rather this struggle to identify ourselves with what is real in us and to let that express through us. So this is what Leadbeater is saying. The first step in our spiritual path, the first step, I mean, the first goal, not the first step. Let's say the first goal is to realize that we are this higher ego. Then beyond that, we start working to realize that we are the monad, etc. The adept goes all the way to a realization that he or she is the logos. But our first goal is to realize we are the higher ego. So let us look into that. Sometimes the consciousness at the level of the higher ego is called causal consciousness. Remember, in the consciousness as it expressed in the causal body. And let's see another quote from Plotinus. He says, I often wake up from my body into my true self. I enjoy a vision of wonderful beauty. It is then that I am part of the nobler realm, the noetic realm, the higher, what in theosophy we call the higher mental plane. Living a life of perfect activity, I have become at one with the divine. So this is something that he says that sometimes he could raise his consciousness to the nous, to the undescended aspect of himself, and that is a wonderful life, a life in which we are at one with the divine. And then he says in his writing, I'm giving you the references there because it's interesting if you want to read the material around these quotes. Then he says something like, how come that then I descend and then I'm back into this body? You know, why couldn't I stay being who I really am? And then I'm shut down and off again in my body. So let's see, in the theosophical tradition, we have several remarkable individuals who claimed to have been able to experience their nature as a higher ego and even beyond that in a direct way. And this is very important because, you know, in antiquity, when the Plotinus was writing, there was this idea that we are the spiritual entity, and you have some prophets that may have experienced some of that. But normally the idea is that this is reserved for very advanced or special individuals. And although this is true to some extent, as we are going to see, the path to realize that we are the soul is open to all of us. And there are clear practices that in which we can engage to make this more and more real. So let's see a little first Blavatsky talking about the kind of consciousness that is at that level. She says the higher ego, as part of the essence of the universal mind, is unconditionally omniscient on its own plane. So on its own plane, or on our own plane as the higher ego, as the soul, the disembodied soul, the undescended soul. You know, the ray that is in us is the descended or embodied aspect of the soul. But we are talking about the undescended aspect of ourselves on the higher mental plane. We are unconditionally omniscient. That means that whatever we perceive on that realm we perceive it correctly. We see the truth in it. That is not yet true for the lower planes, because the moment that we send the ray of ourselves to the lower planes, we don't, or that ray doesn't retain the ability to see the truth. And therefore we live in ignorance and in doubt, etc. But on our own plane, anything that we perceive, we see the truth of it. We may not be able to perceive everything. We may not be able to perceive the depth of that very spiritual realm, because we are evolving. Our ability of perception is still limited, and part of what we are doing is expanding that ability of perception. But whatever we perceive it right. And that's the kind of omniscience, in other quotes, Blavatsky explains here this, and she calls it inherent omniscience, which in some philosophical schools, they use that term exactly in this way. Not that you know everything, but whatever you know it right. So she says, again, we are unconditionally omniscient on our own plane, and only potentially so in our terrestrial sphere, in the lower planes, as we have to act solely through our alter ego, the personal self. Because on the lower planes, we are trying to act only through that little ray. And then she says, the real ego does not think as his evanescent and temporary personality does. In the thoughts of the real man, of the real in us, or the immortal individuality, the pictures and visions of the past and future are as present, nor are his thoughts like ours, subjective pictures in our cerebration, in our minds, in our brains, but living acts and deeds, present actualities. Because we are talking about the higher mental plane, every thought is an action. When you think of thinking on that plane, don't think of it, as Blavatsky says, as ideas running through your brain. On the higher mental plane, to the activity of the mental consciousness is an act. And also past and future are present along with us. Of course, not the infinite future, but the future so far as it has been created karmically by us. And we can see the previous incarnations, the experience of time. Jeffrey Hodgson, another important theosophist, would describe later, we will see some of his description of this, and he would say that at the level of the higher ego, all your incarnations, your past incarnations, are there present as what you were doing just before you signed up for, or you log in for this class. You know what you were doing 5 minutes before, and it's very present in your mind. Well, in the same way, all our past incarnations are present with us as at the level of the higher ego. So this is why she says that the past and the future are there with us. And then another quote, she says, the spiritual ego, this is, technically speaking, this is something a little deeper. This is when we as a soul realize our identity with what we call buddhi in theosophical literature. Buddhi is comes from the same root as the word Buddha. And at the level of buddhi, there is a consciousness that is enlightened, let's say. So that's what Blavatsky sometimes called the spiritual ego, as opposed to the higher ego. So she says the spiritual ego reflects no varying states of consciousness. It's independent of all sensation or experience, she says. It does not think. It knows by an intuitive process only faintly conceivable by the average man. So as we grow as a higher ego, we start getting in touch with this more direct perception that we call the spiritual intuition. in which there is an immediate enlightened understanding of whatever we perceive. And we even transcend the mental activity that is on the higher mental plane. I brought this up just to show that there is more to be developed. And of course, if we go even higher to what we call the atmic plane, consciousness expands even more. But again, let us come back. Our first goal is to realize, to experience our true nature as a higher ego. So let me give you some description by Jeffrey Hodgson of his experience when he was on that state of consciousness. So he says, causal consciousness is supramental awareness. It's beyond the mind as we normally understand it. He says it is a thought-free existence where there is perpetual perception of truth, perfect understanding of whatever is perceived. This is what I was explaining that Blavatsky talks about in her writings. So thought-free existence in the sense that, again, there is no thinking as we understand it. And we can act on the higher mental plane, and those are mental actions, but they don't resemble what we think of as thinking. So he continues, and when I'm reading this description, try to visualize this is who you really are. Right now you are operating through this little ray that you sent, and through the limitations of the physical body and the emotions and the mind. But this is a description of who you really are. You never cease to be this, even though you may not be aware of this right now. But this is a description of your true nature. So causal consciousness abides in a state of unity, identity, non-distinction. There is very little sense of I-ness. There's still some I-ness there. That's why it's called higher ego, the higher I-ness. But it is an I-ness that does not separate you from the rest. Because it's a spiritual manifestation of I-ness, it expresses as a sense of I exist, I am. There is a center of consciousness there, but there is this sense of connection, of unity, of sharing with anything that you can perceive. There is this sense of being connected, not connected from afar, but being in touch with anything that you perceive. So there is still a sense of I-ness, but not separative I-ness. So he continues, there is an abiding sense of oneness, of being in the presence of something that is common to everything. Space and time limitations cannot exist. There is no distance, no movement from here to there, no appearing and disappearing, beginning and ending. All is here, all is now. So this is another important feature of the causal consciousness. You may be living in England right now, and I'm here in the States, and our bodies are separate, but at the level of the higher ego, on the higher mental plane, there is no distance in that sense. We can be in the immediate presence of each other, no matter where the bodies are. And the same with anybody in humanity, or with our loved ones that may be living, their bodies may be living in another country. At the level of the higher ego, we are in the immediate presence of anybody we love, basically, people that we, on the higher mental plane, as we are going to see, there is no room for anything but spiritual feeling. So what brings you close to somebody is just that you have a bond with that person. It's not that you can realize oneness with everything that happens on higher planes, but again, with anybody that you know, you can have this sense of oneness. So all is here, all is now, as he says. And then in causal consciousness, you are formless. Of course, there is this, as Plotinus said, well, if you have to think of a form, there is this sphere. Hodgson describes it is like a focus of light extending within an ocean of light of all kinds of colors, because each color, beautiful, divine colors that express the movements of consciousness of people, of the souls there. So, you are basically formless. You are a center of radiance. Okay, he is saying this here. You are a center of radiance in an ocean of beautiful infinite light, having nobody to care for, to maintain, to operate from. There is an enormous sense of lightness and freedom, because here we need to move the physical body and the emotions and the mind, and sometimes our bodies may be tired, and when we are trying to understand something, we are making an effort. Our experience of expressing ourselves on the lower planes is one of effort, of limitations. But on the higher mental plane, the causal body is unperceived in the sense. It's so spiritual that it doesn't oppose any resistance to us. Therefore, there is an enormous sense of lightness and freedom. No sense of effort of any kind. There is only one being, only existence, which is all sufficient. Here at the level of the personality, we have the sense that we are limited, that we have to improve ourselves, that we have to accomplish things, that we have to act right and refrain ourselves from acting wrong. So there is always this sense of, I am not right in the way I am. I have to make an effort to be right or to grow or to, none of this exists at the level of us as a soul, because we are divine entities. Of course, there is an evolution, there is an expansion a gradual expansion of how deep our realization is of our divine nature, as well as an expansion of how I don't want to use how much, it's not a question of amount, but let's say how much we can perceive of the spiritual aspect of the cosmos. So there is a growth, but there is no sense of, I need to do this because I am deficient. The level of the higher ego, there is always a sense of being complete, even if that completeness keeps expanding. So no sense of effort of any kind. There is only being, only existence, and just being is all sufficient. Causal consciousness is always in a relaxed intensity, high energy, but perfectly calm. There is balanced equipoise. It is surrounded by a restful but dynamic stillness, complete tranquility beyond the sway of the opposites, which can never be disturbed. There is a non-rational and non-emotional, intense but serene bliss, for which there are no words. So you see, this state is beyond thoughts, and it's also beyond emotions as we understand them. Sometimes when we experience states of consciousness beyond the physical body, there can be experiences with strong emotions, either joyful or sorrowful emotions, which produce some kind of disturbance in ourselves, either too much excitement or too much sorrow. Sometimes when we think of bliss, we may think of it as an extension or expansion of pleasure, but pleasure itself is tiresome. Pleasure is something that is not restful. The bliss at the level of the higher ego is one, see how much he used the word peace, undisturbed, equipoise, calm, very intense. You are not sleeping. But the difference between a truly spiritual experience and a psychic experience is that the spiritual experience will never produce a lack of balance. There is always this equipoise, this perfect stillness, which is deeply blissful, but a bliss that has to do more with peace, harmony, with the sense of no needs, with a sense of just being is enough. That's deeply blissful, but it's not pleasure as we normally think of it. So Hodgson says, meditate, contemplate, withdraw the thoughts daily from the external fanciful world of changing things and fix them upon the eternal verities within. Seek, find, come to know little by little that divine light, that speck or sparkle, which is the true self. Invoke it down into mind and brain. It will answer, and little by little, if we patiently proceed, we will come to know our true home. So these descriptions, Hodgson described his experience of the higher ego in many of his writings. And then you have also descriptions from HPB, which tend to be more technical. In my book, Evolution of the Higher Consciousness, I collected everything that I found when she described the qualities of our higher consciousness. And the purpose of that is because, as Hodgson says here, part of the way in which we can realize our true self is by meditating on this, meditating and contemplating our true nature, which means you start, perhaps take one of the qualities that seems inspiring to you, or you can meditate on all the qualities, and then reflect on that, but not as if you were thinking philosophically about it and just trying to bring the knowledge that you have about that, and like if you were giving a lecture, with your eyes closed. The idea of meditating on this is make an effort to feel, to realize what you are meditating on. So if you are meditating on the higher ego, or I as a soul, you can say in your meditation, my true nature as a soul is one of profound harmony, where everything is fine just being. Profound harmony, profound peace, because I'm eternal. I'm eternal. I cannot be hurt. I cannot be wrong. I'm an eternal divine entity. So there is profound peace and harmony. And as you meditate on that, try to feel that. And this is how we start realizing the higher nature. You may not have the full conscious realization of you as this globe of light with all these qualities, but you can start perceiving this, in a sense, the echo of your true nature, when you can invoke or evoke those feelings within us, within yourself in your meditation. And these feelings become more and more real, become more and more easily to evoke, until they start remaining with you. They begin to be the background reality of who you are. So this is an important aspect of our practice, and meditating on the qualities of the higher ego is one of them. The other one that can be helpful, and with this I'm going to finish, is Blavatsky's diagram of meditation. I think that the diagram of meditation, of course, there are some questions whether we don't know much about the story of the diagram. One of her close students, Sturdy, E.T. Sturdy, said that Blavatsky gave him this diagram of meditation. It probably was in the context of a private conversation, so we don't have much more proof than what Sturdy said. However, I think this is very valuable, and I can accept that this came from Blavatsky or from somebody that knew what he or she was talking about. So I'm not going to show the whole diagram, but I want to show you how you can use this diagram in this way. There is some preliminary meditation that she recommends. First, conceive of unity by expansion in space and time, and then try to have a sense of you as the one, and then meditate on that in connection to your normal states of consciousness, to see the contrast. And basically, this is what she does next in the diagram. The diagram has some, what she calls acquisitions, things that we should develop, and deprivations, things that we should let go of. And this is basically what she's doing. I think she's contrasting our spiritual nature with our normal states of consciousness. And what we have to do is to try to make our normal states of consciousness be molded by the spiritual consciousness. So for example, here I'm presenting it in a different way than the diagram. You can find the diagram online. But she says, for example, that the normal state of your consciousness must be molded by a perpetual presence in imagination in all space and time. So this is one description that we saw of the higher ego, that there is no space and time limitations there at the level of the higher ego. So you try to bring that sense into your consciousness, first in meditation, then you can try to bring it into your daily life. And at the same time, the deprivations, she says, constant refusal to think of the reality of separations and meetings, associations with places, times, and forms. As I said, our bodies may be in different continents, but that's our bodies. That's not our true nature. In our true nature, we are beyond the limitations. The problem is that we are so used to identifying ourselves with the limitations that we cannot perceive except through them. So this diagram of meditation is a way to try to realize that unconditioned perception that is within us, that is the higher ego. So you can do this. You can refuse and say, the body is separated, or the body is living, the body is doing this or that. You can tell yourself, for example, but I am everywhere. You start doing this just as a mental exercise, but eventually you start grasping the true reality behind. Then she says, your normal state of consciousness should be molded by a continued attempt at attitude of mind to all things, to all existing things, an attitude which is neither love, hate, nor indifference. Love and hate in the sense of like and dislike. So she's saying, try to look at everything in a way that is not conditioned by your likes, dislikes, or indifference. You can say, well, I don't care. I neither like nor dislike this because I don't care about it. No, what she's trying to generate is a state of full attention, full involvement, but that is not conditioned by the personal likes and dislikes. Of course, externally, you must be different in external activity to each, because in each the capacity alters, but mentally the same to all. So if there is a person that is killing people on the street, well, you may have, you as society may have to put it on a jail. Externally, this may be necessary to protect the other people. But if mentally, internally, you operate from the spiritual nature, then the jail will not be just a punishment. The jail will be something that is trying to help the person grow to whatever degree that person may grow, for example. And along with this, she says, a constant refusal to think of the reality of the distinction between friends and foes. Nobody's your friend, nobody's your enemy, all are alike your teachers, as Light on the Path says. So this is how the higher nature looks at things. And the last one, then the normal states of consciousness should be molded by a perception in all embodied beings of limitation only. If you understand that when you are dealing with people and situations on the physical plane, you are dealing only with this little ray of what they are. You are not dealing with the true divine nature of that person. So if you realize this, there will be, she says in the diagram of meditation, that then you can arrive as a rational assessment of a situation without blaming or without praising. When you understand that you are dealing just with the most conditioned plane and the most conditioned conditions, then you can be far more relaxed, trying to do the right thing, but far more relaxed in your expectations. And then along with this, a constant refusal to think of the reality of possessions, which can only be possessed by separate beings, the personality, which is a limitation of who you are, and sensation that can come only through the separate physical body. So these are some examples of how we can try to start working to realize our higher nature. Of course, there are many other things. The whole spiritual life is essentially for this. If we have clear in our minds that this is the aim, then we can grow more consistently. But, I wanted to present today in particular this approach of get to know your true nature, reading the literature descriptions of your true nature, and then meditate on that so that you can start making a reality in your personal consciousness of what you are as a spiritual entity. All right, so that's all for the talk. So now we can go to questions, answer, comments.